when I said to her, tell me about your call to ministry, she said, oh, I see myself in a white robe, standing in the pulpit, everybody gazing up at me adoringly where I preach this stupendous sermon. And so I tried to press her a bit. Well, we do preach, but there's a lot of other things going on. And it became clear that she had this kind of idealized vision of ministry where she would be looked up to, where she could be on stage. And so we actually, it was a student, we actually counseled with her, and she ultimately, interestingly enough, left the ministry and went into acting and is now in Los Angeles trying to be an actress.
Ministry is not acting, but it does involve assuming a role. That role, one of spiritual teacher or pastoral counselor, defines our motives and our actions within a professional capacity.
Coming this Sunday, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, starring Reverend Jonathan Edwards.
I think when we use the pulpit for our own personal agenda, we've crossed a line.
That perhaps there's an issue that's going on in the board, and for whatever reason the pastor is not able to find clear communication and resolution, and suddenly Old Testament passages, especially from Leviticus, starts to just flow freely from the pulpit. And what happens is that the ministry of the word then becomes agenda-driven communication. And in many ways, pulpits are frequently used as passive-aggressive weapons.
Whose needs am I there to meet when I'm preaching to people?
Trying to promote themselves, trying to prove how good or smart. We are all in danger of doing that. That's a constant temptation. I fight it. It's very easy to want to make myself sound good. I work against it. It's very easy to make myself the star of my own story.
People who have a presence, even folks who are dramatic, there's a real role for that. The caution would be is it focused on me as a pastor, or are we simply sort of transmitting the message of the church, the love of God for somebody?
You can manipulate people emotionally. And in fact, sometimes that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Sometimes our job as clergy is to be prophets, and that means saying things that they're not ready to hear, they don't want to hear. There's a lot of power there. There's a lot of opportunity to go over a line.
One Sunday, without consulting the parish council or anybody else, he purchased with parish funds 800 copies of the book, Bread for the World, and he put them in the pews. And then he stood up on Sunday and preached to the people a very scolding kind of homily. The readings were very appropriate, but what he did with the readings was basically to say, you're all rich people and you're all overfed and overstuffed and you're all overweight and you need to give more money, and I want you to purchase these copies of the Bread for the World and give extra money to World Hunger Today. At the end of the 4 Sunday liturgies, most of the copies of Bread for the World were still in the pews. They hadn't bought them, and the people voted with their feet and voted with their lives.
I think scolding sermons don't work, for one thing, and they make people pretty angry. And I've had people angry because I've challenged them on a justice issue, but I've tried not to attack them personally.
The pulpit certainly is a valuable resource in terms of a public opportunity to present our ideas, to promote ideas, to encourage and support and challenge people. But there's a fine line between that and an agenda which is, in effect, self-serving.
When you put on those robes, you are saying something about your role in the world and your role in the community. And then the community is saying, oh, who's this guy? And you become a wonderful, say, target for projection.
He quacks like a duck. He looks like a duck. Except for the fact that he's a little wooden, he could be my father.
I don't think that transference is unhealthy. I think transference is, it's like we were talking about sexual energy that comes up, it's just energy, and so it has to happen in order for there to be juice in the relationship for people to be able to change each other.
There are a lot of women and men in our culture who grew up in families where their fathers are either physically or emotionally absent. And so if you are a reasonably healthy, reasonably warm, compassionate human being and happen to be a man, there's going to be inevitable transference. They're going to say, wow, here's somebody who actually listens to me. Now, if I don't understand what's going on there and say, well, this is a pretty normal kind of situation, and I can be aware of that, if I pick up on that and take that very personally and say, wow, this person really likes me as an individual person, and then I begin to counter-transfer, which is to say, I want to respond to that, then the dance psychologically can become complex, difficult, and even dangerous.
Each of us carries around templates in some ways of what relationships are going to be like. The other person's going to be rejecting or very loving or adoring. And we carry those around with us, and transference refers to when we apply that template to another person in relationship, independent of what that other person presents or offers us.
I became very close to a woman who I think was almost a mother figure for me. She was about the age my mother would have been had she been still living. And she just had that sort of nurturing role. She got cancer, and it was a very difficult course of treatment for her. And I spent a lot of time with her, and I think it was important to her, but at some point I began to be aware it was also really important to me. And while I think it was okay to feel nurtured by visits, I had to sort of remind myself, this is not my mother. I needed to be a different person with her. She needed a pastor who could walk with her in that sort of spiritual journey and not unload on her more grief than she was also needing to deal with her own family. And I remember that was hard. I can remember going to my spiritual director and just crying and saying, I will miss Esther so much, and realizing that at that point she was more than a parishioner for me.
The tall and short hug. The one-sided hug. The manly hug. And the always popular bear hug.
Well, no, we have no policy around it, but this is California, There's a lot of hugging, which is, it's taken me some time to get used to, but it seems natural.
Our careful boundaries in a helping relationship certainly begin with being careful about our physical interactions, touch boundaries.
And during the celebration of the Catholic liturgy, the sacrament of the Eucharist, there is a time in which you share the gift of peace. And that could be a handshake, it could be a hug. But there are many people, some of whom I've talked to personally, who've been through sexual traumas of various kind, who don't want to be touched or let alone hugged. They may accept a handshake or just, I wish you peace, and that's enough.
When somebody is in need, there are lots of ways to meet that need, and there are lots of ways for me to meet that need without crossing the boundaries incorrectly.
Or individuals who come to me and say, I'm really hurting, I'm feeling suicidal, or I'm very depressed, and it would help me a whole lot if you would hold me. I would probably say to them, you know, I want to support you and strengthen you. I want to give you some level of solace. But holding you may not be the best way to do that. That's probably not what you really need. Now, I'm not talking about situations at funerals or in great crises and tragic accidents. There are appropriate times when you can hold someone at times of great loss and pain. But I'm thinking of when someone comes to you for spiritual advice, particularly as, again, you pick up, there's a lot more need here than I can meet. And that's why self-awareness and reading the emotional cues become such an important part of our ministry.
There seem to be some assumptions and expectations that people have about physical contact with us. There seems to be, on the part of some congregants, assumptions of physical access, so being more touchy and with the woman minister and expecting her to reciprocate.
Yeah, and because I'm small and I'm Asian and I've been like patted on the head and patted on the shoulder and patted on you know where. And so I said, you wouldn't do this to another male, would you? And another tall guy. And they said, oh, well, then I become more assertive about this. And then they're shocked. They still like want to keep me in my place, small, nice Asian.
And puts us in a very difficult position if that's something that we're just not comfortable with. How do you set that limit with a congregant who sees themselves as being friendly and affectionate and so forth and so on?
Towards them, a student comes towards them with the California hug, you know, ready for the California hug, then they put their hands into the Buddhist gesture of respect, and they do this. And the person is often a little taken aback, but then they quickly come from here to here, and then bow. And there's actually a lovely intimacy in that, in making eye contact and bowing to each other from the heart.
This particular congregation where I'm a pastor now, hugs are rare. But listening, carrying acts, appropriate nurturing of people, that's a very important value, and we see it all the time.
Some people have reacted to the discussion about careful boundaries with a very sort of all or nothing, well, I just won't ever touch anyone again. And they, you know, literally physically move back or move away. And then everything will be fine. That's not going to help. For one thing, touch is such an important part of interacting between people that we need to be able to, when it's appropriate, reach out and touch in a pastoral role. But there's a limit to that touch and to situations in which that may or may not be appropriate, depending on the other person and what their experience has been and what their needs are and so forth.
Crossing the border from this area to this area can be very dangerous.
Fine line between the intimacy that we have as a pastor with a parishioner and our own need for personal intimacy. What we do in ministry is very personal. When you're with someone and they're dying and you're holding their hand and you're listening to them and you're praying with them, that's as intimate as it gets, and that's very holy, precious time. But the intimacy I need as a woman, the intimacy I need in my own spiritual life, I need to get from my partner, from a spiritual director or another pastor.
Spirituality, intimacy, and sexuality are all dealing with the real personal, deeper part, the deep part of who I am as a human being. And when we talk about spirituality, we're talking about an intimate connection with ourselves and God. And when we talk about sexuality, we're talking about an intimate connection with ourselves and another. And it seems to me that we can get mixed up there.
My Dharma sister is in her 80s now, Jo Quebec, and she told me that in her 70s, young male students who are in their 20s would come to her and confess in the spiritual interview. that they had fallen in love with her. And she said, obviously it wasn't me, because there I am, 70 years old. And what it is that people fall in love with what we call the Dharma, the truth underlying the universe. And when they catch a glimpse of that in a person who studies that and works with that all the time, what they're really seeing is themselves, their spiritual potential.
People are unaccustomed to the kind of unconditional positive regard that professionals are supposed to be presenting for the individual. They're not accustomed to it, and so they're surprised by it, even though that's what they come to get. And then it gets confused with, I'm special. This is a special relationship, and they want it in all domains of their life. And that includes the physical expression of love, which might translate into sex.
To be naked before another person is our greatest desire, to be totally seen, physically naked and stripped to the core, to have someone know us down to our very deepest, darkest, nastiest nooks and crannies and still say, I love you. So that's our desire in the intimate relationship. It's also our desire in the spiritual relationship to have someone, could be a psychiatrist, could be a therapist, it could be our spiritual teacher or guide, to see us to the very bottom of our being and say, well, here's a part you need to work on, but you're really okay as you are.
Sex is an expression of mutual intimacy. And the professional role in and of itself is one way, it's only one-way intimacy.
I think ideally we think of sex as an example of crossing of a boundary that very few people cross with one another. A physical expression of a more emotional or spiritual even intimacy or connection or commitment to the other person.
So the same with sexual energy. When sexual energy arises in a relationship, I think it's saying, oh, the boundaries are going down. Isn't that interesting? I feel safe with this person.
Sexual intimacy is an expression of not just love, but it's also an expression of openness and vulnerability, to mutual openness and vulnerability to one another. And that is not what's going on in the professional relationship.
It might be nice to think that all of us are so enticing and good-looking that people are just coming out of the woodwork for us, but I don't really believe it's about us at all. It's about our role. It's about wanting to get close to power. It's about wanting to get close to this kind of God source that people feel comes from a clergy person.
Within a therapist-client relationship or pastor-congregant relationship, there is that quality of confidentiality and uniqueness, and what's in this room stays in this room. And sometimes that gets confused with secrecy. And there's something about secrecy that I think might engender sexual feelings as well, a heightened sense of excitement or arousal because this is secret and special.
But he was hugging and kissing a parishioner, and he would say, this is a secret between us. I really love you, and you do a lot for me, but we have spouses, and I'm the minister, we can't tell anybody. And sort of enticed her into that by saying, you're the only person in the church who really knows who I am. That's very seductive language to say to anybody, I've let you know me completely.
As I was in a pastoral counseling relationship with a man who became very vulnerable and open to me, more than he had probably been with anyone else before, and I felt the sexual tension growing in the room, and I knew something was happening. I was uncomfortable with it. I was embarrassed about it. I didn't seek supervision because I felt so guilty and uncomfortable with it, and I broke my own rule. And I knew that I had contributed to it in some fashion, and I didn't like it. By the fourth session, when he came in to see me, I said, there's something going on here that feels sexual to me. What do you know about this? And he said, oh, I'm so glad you mentioned it. I am confused. It does feel sexual to me, and I don't want it to feel this way. I love my wife, but I want to be able to talk to you. And at that point, I could step back and say, well, I think this is about how intimate you have been able to be with me, how open you've been with me, and the only other place you've been that intimate is probably with your wife. So it sounds like we're confusing intimacies.
I think if it's so alive in the room that it becomes a part of your time together, that it needs to be addressed in some ways.
Certainly, we can't legislate who we're attracted to, but we can make choices about whether we act on that or not. Just because I'm married doesn't mean I may not be attracted sexually to someone, but it's a whole different story if I decide to act on that or not.
All forms of intimacy have the same potential power and the same potential problems, and sexual intimacy more so than any others. When you cross the boundary and you become sexually intimate with someone, you know them in a way that links you together differently than any other person. But it also means that they become different to you than anybody else, and they can't be your congregant anymore. If it's going to be a good relationship, then they have to stop being your congregant, or you can't have a true relationship with them.
Certainly, the expectations on the part of some congregants for friendships and more intimate relationships with their religious leaders can be substantial. So the pressure is coming, from them. Again, it's our job to be clear about the limits to those relationships in their interest as well as in our own interest.
A certain kind of social relationship and romantic and sexual relationship actually paradoxically minimizes the spiritual relationship.
One of my mottos is don't take anything personally. So that has two branches. Don't take the student's love for you personally. It has nothing to do with you. You are just a transparent channel for this higher truth. But you can use the energy of that connection that the person has to the higher power through you in a skillful way. Now, one of the things you have to keep doing is taking yourself down off the pedestal, because the students will keep trying to put you up on the pedestal. Everyone hopes that there's somebody out there who's perfect, and if they can make themselves just like that, then their life will be okay.